Reforging the Ring podcast. There's no doubt our economic systems have helped us build great things, but they're also driving us to unsustainably extract resources so a select few can accumulate abstract, non-tangible wealth in the form of money. In this podcast, we'll be exploring the mechanisms of this winner-takes-all economy and what a system that works for everyone might look like. We'll be discussing our economic system through the lens of the Metacrisis, the underlying crisis behind climate change, ecological collapse, social injustice, and all of the other major challenges we face as a planetary society. It basically refers to our inability to coordinate effectively at a global scale, without causing deadly catastrophes or resorting to 1984-style all-controlling dystopias. In this first episode, we'll be discussing the three mechanisms driving our current economic system to self-destruction: abstraction, extraction, and accumulation. This is what Daniel Schmachtenberger, a key thinker on the Metacrisis, has referred to as the ring of power, an unholy trinity which needs to be reforged in the fires of Mordor by those stubborn and incorruptible enough to escape the call of its power. But first, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Andrea Farias, and I'm a researcher and creator working at the meeting point between digital technologies, social justice, and ecosystem regeneration.
Hi there, I'm Stephen Reed, a facilitator, coach, and Ruby Python developer. I've trained in the fields of complexity science, physics, AI, transformative coaching, meditation, and plant medicine. I'm currently working with Supermodular on Metacrisis.xyz, leading the development of Dandelion.events, and hosting the Future Craft residencies.
Hi, my name is Sam, and to this point, my work has mostly revolved around the evolutionary process of voting protocols, with a specific focus on the way that these voting protocols influence the decision-making procedures of our core institutions. Now, trying to wrap my head around these big picture predicaments has shown me just how much I don't know. And that's one of many reasons why I'm excited for this podcast. It provides an opportunity to build a bridge between brilliant minds across a variety of disciplines, and we can integrate our ideas into a comprehensive model for addressing the metacrisis.
So many people watching this podcast might be familiar with Daniel Schmachtenberger. He's become one of the key thinkers on the metacrisis over the past few years. What you might not know is that way back in 2017, Daniel wrote a series of articles on a new economic system. 4 articles. There was a promised 5th article as well, which we're still looking forward to. And in the 4th article, he spoke of this ring of power. And Andrea's going to tell us something more about that.
Yeah, so we actually want to kick this off with a short quote that that explains what is the ring of power before we actually launch into a deeper discussion on some of the key points here. So Daniel Schmachtenberger says, the extraction, abstraction, and accumulation cycle forms an autopoietic, self-evolving loop. The capacity for each of these increases our ability to further increase these capacities, leading to a classic self-reinforcing exponential curve. We affectionately refer to this autopoietic triplicate as the ring of power. It is figuratively what needs to be taken back to Mordor and destroyed, or rather smelted into something else. And what is that something else? That is really what we want to explore through this podcast.
But first, we're going to spend some time unpacking each of those 3 elements of the ring of power: the extraction, abstraction, and accumulation. We've divided those up amongst the 3 of us. So I'm going to be talking a bit about, or leading the discussion on accumulation, and then Sam's going to be speaking about extraction, and then Andrea on abstraction. And it's going to be discursive throughout, whilst one of us is going to lead the discussion, the others are going to be chipping in. So guys, how do you feel about me kicking off with accumulation?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, nice one. Okay. So accumulation is the result of extraction. I mean, I know we haven't spoken yet about extraction in detail, but if we think about extraction as the process, the act, the accumulation is the result of that. So we can think of corn or timber piling up in warehouses, and which the warehouses part suggests something else very important, is that accumulation also requires storage technology. You need extractive technology and you need storage technology. And without either of those things, you're not going to get accumulation. And it's worth noting that for most of history, humans did not engage in accumulation to any significant degree. We were basically, picking fruit off trees. We were like hunting game as it was moving through the forest. We tended not to store very much stuff, partly because the technology was somewhat primitive, but perhaps also because the mindset didn't exist. There wasn't the desire to accumulate in the same way that we certainly see in the modern era. So I'll pause there in case there's any clarifications on what I just said.
Yeah. Well, I think for a nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe, there's no way to confer status through accumulation, because you'd only be slowing everybody down if you were trying to take a whole bunch of stuff with you everywhere you went, right? It's a completely different mindset in a completely different environment. But the thing that's unique about humanity is that we are as blank of a slate as nature can create, meaning we are socially soft wired by the environment around us, and what is socially rewarded is the behaviors that we will trend towards as societies over time. And so as we moved from that more nomadic hunter-gatherer setting into the agricultural revolution, and accumulation became valuable because that stored food surplus is the most important thing for preserving your people, especially during hard times, that completely changes the status game to then revolve around accumulation. And a lot of our incentives that we see today are a direct result of that long run trend.
Nice. Yeah, I think that point about status is really important. And that's, of course, become a more and more prominent part of modern economies, and showing status through various forms of accumulation. Yeah, Andrea, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you were saying about the ability to extract, the technology to extract, and the technology to actually store. It reminds me of something I was reading about societies transitioning to agriculture, and this is kind of for me, it's a new idea that's emerging of like, did we domesticate wheat, or did wheat domesticate us, right? And this idea, I've seen it in a few different places now, but I think it really relates to this because, of course, what you were saying about mindset, right? Before wheat domesticated us, actually being a hunter-gatherer was a lot less work than working in agriculture. So actually, maybe just wandering the earth and picking fruit off the trees and just eating what was there. Obviously, it's easy to romanticize. It can't have been an easy life, but there's definitely a freedom attached to it. And I can imagine how communities would have been kind of very, very proud and very happy with that lifestyle. Whereas accumulation really requires not just a different mindset, a different kind of lifestyle and a different way of being with oneself and within community, that just changes the game completely.
Yeah, I've read some incredible reports of people kind of landing in the Americas, Westerners landing in the Americas for the first time, and just being absolutely startled by the incredible abundance of fruit trees and animals and so on that was just there for the taking. And elsewhere I've heard that indeed, as you say, Andrea, like actually hunter-gatherers spent only a few hours a day, like taking care of their nutritional needs, is what many anthropologists think nowadays. It wasn't tons of work. It's hard for us to imagine now because, of course, we've we've made the natural world so barren, but it wasn't always like that. Sam, you were going to say something before, sorry.
Yeah, my mind actually jumped to a very similar place with the early stories of the Americas. There is this really fascinating phenomenon where there were a lot of early settlers who, in one way or another, had joined with the native tribes and wanted to live there and stayed there. Like even when they were like taken back, they would always find a way to escape and go rejoin the natives. But the opposite effect was never seen. There was never any time where like a native wanted to go be with the settlers and put in the 12 plus hours of grueling farm labor versus the life that they had that was actually really good. And like you were saying before, Andrea, it's not that we want to over romanticize that time. And obviously in modernity, we're looking at a completely different life than somebody in the 1600s had, say. But there is something to be said for understanding our evolutionary roots and where we come from.
Nice. So let's see, where do I want to go with accumulation? Well, mass accumulation that we see nowadays of all kinds of resources has been critical to the growth of this modern civilization and human population. Accumulation allows humans to make it through hard times by tapping on those accumulated resources when previously failure to extract a sufficient quantity of food from the environment just in a given season would have resulted in population decrease. This, of course, is the danger of living a nomadic lifestyle. It's like it's all going fine and kind of until it's not, until you get a particularly hard winter, or like your main source of food has its own problems and gets wiped out, and then it's not there for you to eat and so on. And that's a major drive for accumulation as a kind of insurance policy. And that accumulation has driven population growth as far as I can tell. And it's worth saying it's not necessarily a problem until and unless it involves an unsustainable rate of extraction. You can imagine small scale accumulation techniques like just taking a few more fish from the lake than you're going to eat that day, and you dry them out and you save them for the winter, and there's no problem with that as far as I can tell. Like the accumulation becomes problematic, when it involves that unsustainable rate of extraction, which is a hallmark of modern capitalism. Maybe we'll come on to that more in the section on extraction. So just one more point before I pause again. So accumulation, an unsustainable rate of extraction, so a rate of extraction faster than the natural rate of replenishment of that resource, is intimately linked to Molochian dynamics, these multipolar traps. So kind of one of the classic examples, if a set of villages in a forest have been sustainably harvesting timber for generations, and then one village starts cutting down more than their fair share, and the next village along notices that, then that second village thinks, well, if they're going to cut down the timber at an unsustainable rate, then we better do it too, because if anyone's going to end up with all the timber, then it might as well be us, because at least we're good people, and not the kind of like scumbags that started this like them. And so it has this fascinating effect that just one actor accumulating at an unsustainable rate actually incentivizes all the others to do the same, and then you end up in a situation that basically no one desired, but everyone feels somehow forced into this. And of course, this kind of dynamic, this Moloch dynamic, has become well discussed in recent years.
Yeah, I guess that kind of suggests to me that any kind of solution needs to be sort of applied and shared by all of the people who actually have access to that resource, right? Because as you said, when even one actor starts to accumulate unsustainably, then it incentivizes everyone who uses that resource to do so as well. So it always needs to be kind of a communal understanding and a communal practice, right? It doesn't make sense to for one user to have certain rules that don't apply to the other.
Yeah, totally. And actually, thinking through that point, I started thinking about relationship and reliance on a place, on particular places. Say that I see that the collective behavior of the villagers in that forest means that there's going to be no trees left for anyone to use, even if I didn't really realize the multipolar trap dynamics beforehand. Then if this forest is the only forest that I can harvest timber from, that is anywhere in my area, that, or maybe I have some sacred connection to it, then that's a powerful incentive to come to some kind of community solution. However, if I know that there's 100 other forests around and I could just go to some other forest, then it's the incentive to kind of really come to some solution that protects this very forest is much reduced. And that seems to me to be quite a prominent dynamic in the modern economy as well. Like multinational corporations that don't have relationship to place, like they're just going from one forest to the next, extracting it for all it's worth. There's no real interest or incentive for them to take care of any particular forest, much less any particular tree. And that can be very different when you have a group of people or communities that actually are bound to that place in some way. And for me, this binding to place, or becoming people of places, another way of saying that would be becoming indigenous again, or rediscovering some kind of indigeneity, and seeing the preciousness of this forest and this lake, and not just thinking that, well, whatever, once we're done with this one, we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier about Elinor Ostrom's principles for managing commons when you were talking about, the villages around the lake. But it's also interesting that you point that out, because I think her first principle is, the community that manages the commons, whatever it is, they have to have a shared set of values, right? And I think that's what you're saying around belonging to place and having that spiritual connection, not just saying, well, if we mess this one up, we can just move on, right? It's that set of shared values of, we are from this place and we need to take care of it, that really drives everything else.
Yeah, nice. So let's see, time is getting on, but I just briefly mentioned, so like one sort of specific case of accumulation is accumulation of money, which is a bit different to like the accumulation of physical resources. And one of the strangest aspects of accumulation of money is the phenomenon of interest, which actually incentivizes the accumulation of money, because the more money that I accumulate, the more that I can earn through interest payments. And much has been written and said about the ways in which interest, or more kind of the kind of counterpart, like the debt aspects, incentivizes or drives unsustainable economic behavior. But for now, I just want to note that there are economic systems that don't feature interest, and one prominent example of that would be Islamic finance. That is, you can find all around the world it's forbidden by religious law for the Islamic community to charge interest on debt, and they've come up with all kinds of other interesting mechanisms for still enabling the buying and selling of significant pieces of property. Another, it's less an alternative and more kind of the opposite almost to interest is demurrage, which is basically a negative interest rate, such that money decays over time. like with interest, you have $100 in your bank account today, and in a year you have 105. In with Demirage, you have 95 in a year with a 5% interest rate. And if you know that there's going to be less like dollar value of your money in your bank account in a year's time, that of course incentivizes spending, discourages any kind of hoarding or accumulation of money. So I think that's quite underexplored phenomenon in the kind of new economic design space. I know there's some folks at the Celo blockchain that have written a bit about it, but I'd love to see more experiments involving Demirage. Yeah, any thoughts on the above?
I think what you pointed out with interest in the problems therein is that it is something that Daniel Schmachtenberger and Nate Hagens talk quite a bit about in their Bend Not Break series, which is that interest continuously compounding over time creates an infinite growth obligation on a finite planet. There's no way around that. It's just a math problem. And so in the long term, we really are going to have to find some way to think about the problem of debt and interest very differently than we currently do, because the rate that debt is growing is significantly faster than the rate that the real economy is growing. And so even if we put aside the finite planet boundaries and just look at that specific equation, clearly that's unsustainable. You can't have debt be accelerating at a faster rate than GDP and expect to have any sort of functional economy in the long term. But this really just gets back to the math problem that I stated earlier of interest compounding over time creates that embedded growth obligation. And without finding different ways to address that, we've got some real problems on our hands. Yeah. And so the solutions that you outlined are interesting. I'm thinking that there are other ways that we could potentially go about that as well, but it is something that will have to be addressed in the future of any sustainable economic system.
Yeah. And one thing that came to mind as you were speaking is the idea of debt jubilees, which I understand that various periods in human history have happened quite frequently. And there are some modern examples. I think in the year 2000, there was some campaign for like a debt jubilee for African nations. But one wonders, are we going to see something like that at a much larger scale and across even the Western world in the years to come? And how could that be conducted for maximum benefit? Yeah. It might be a necessity. Yeah. So
yeah.
Okay. So let's see. So some final words on accumulation. So I started wondering, are there any forms of accumulation that could have a positive ecological impact? Like what good or service or product or resource, if any, could we accumulate that would actually be kind of have this positive ecological benefit? And so like we could ask, like, what's stopping us from accumulating rainforests? So, and as far as I got thinking through that, it's really about how do we make trees or rivers or lakes or any other kind of living system or system that like supports life. How do we make those things worth more alive than when they're dead? That's the main problem for a lot of rainforests right now. It's quite easy to see there's some value of them being alive. Like probably the most accessible example would be ecotourism. However, for the most part, various actors in those areas calculate, well, we can make this much through tourism, but we could make this much through, chopping down all of those expensive mahogany trees or whatever it might be. So, so far as we persist in having some kind of market-based system, I think this is one useful way of looking at it. Like how can we make these things worth more alive than dead? And the very beginnings of an answer to that question would be something around like carbon credits and the carbon market, though just looking at carbon is, of course, like an extremely reductive frame. But I wonder whether and how we can extend that to various forms of credit, if you like, or token or NFT, if we want to use kind of Web3 speak, that actually represents a forest or a lake, or even like particular forest or a particular lake, and those things actually having some value in the market system. And this of course is a juicy question, because some people are like really against the idea of pricing nature. I think nature is priceless. Like any attempt to capture the value of ecosystem services is just too dangerous a path to even go down. For myself, I don't know the answer to that question. I think I have an open mind at this point that we should at least like contemplate the possible good that could be done by kind of pricing in ecosystem services, whilst acknowledging the real dangers of trying to turn everything into numbers and everything into pricing everything by dollars. How about you guys? What kind of feeling do you get from this idea of like ecosystem services and bringing them into the money economy?
Well, I was thinking that might actually be a really good transition into Andrea's topic of abstraction and how do we think about our values. And then, yeah, that ties in nicely, because I think really at the heart of economics is how do we program our values into our systems to more accurately represent them. And so go for it, Andrea.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually something that I read a lot about in preparation for this podcast, because it has quite a strong connection with abstraction. But if we just take a little step back to talk about, what is abstraction? So essentially, as the word suggests, it's about making something kind of more, removing something from its original context, making something fuzzier rather than clearer. So, for example, if we think about a tree, in order to be, essentially, abstraction drives accumulation and extraction, because in order for something to be able to be accumulated, it has to be abstracted first. So for example, if you think about a tree, in order to be accumulated, it first needs to be cut down. It needs to be made into wood, into lumber. So it needs to be extracted, essentially, in order to be accumulated. But that's only the extraction is really only the first layer of abstraction. So when you have that wood or when you have that lumber, that represents wealth, right? Because you can use that lumber to build, or you can sell it and get money. So if you do sell that lumber and get money for it, that's then another layer of abstraction, because we started with a tree, right? A tree in a forest, and now we have money. So a tree has all kinds of value, right? In the ecosystem. It provides fruit for people to eat, for animals to eat. It provides homes for smaller animals. It's a whole ecosystem within itself, right? It sequesters carbon dioxide. But we don't really measure that. We don't really consider that value, because it can't be put into anyone's pocket. So the value comes when that tree is abstracted. It's turned into lumber, it's turned into money, and then it can even be turned into digital money in a bank account, which doesn't even have kind of a physical, tangible value. So it's about moving away from tangible value that has a direct impact in the physical world towards kind of more of a representation of value. I'm gonna pause there. Any thoughts from you guys?
That was a great intro from my point of view, and I like how you actually explain these two layers of abstraction going on. I think that's really useful. My mind turns to like, are there even further layers? Like, are there layers of abstraction beyond money that maybe already exist, or like that could exist in some way? I'm not saying that's necessarily desirable, but Yeah, definitely getting the sense of this kind of like this ladder of abstraction.
Yeah, I think abstraction, I mean, we're talking about money now, but it can mean a lot of different things. Even if you take a picture of that tree, that is another kind of abstraction, right? It's a representation of the real thing, but a picture of a tree is not the tree, obviously. But I think that with money, that distinction becomes a lot more important because we value money so much more than the tree, right? Because money represents the ability to get anything you want. Anything becomes kind of tradable, and it provides access. I think it's kind of related to what you were saying around, if a person is not from a place, then and they can go anywhere to any forest, they don't have kind of a reason to protect that specific forest or that specific tree. Again, with money, if you have the ability to get anything you want with a piece of paper, why would you care about protecting that specific tree when you can turn that tree into whatever you want by turning it into money?
You probably heard this proverb that when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish caught, and the last river poisoned, only then will we realize that we cannot eat money.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so essentially is that we're willing to harm the things of real value to accumulate more abstract value, which might make sense in the short term, but obviously in the long term is not very sustainable. And yeah, so I guess let's jump back here to the idea of putting a price on nature, good or bad idea. So some of the pros to this idea is obviously that, we're doing this podcast, we're talking about an economic system which is not working. We're talking about the Metacrisis, which, we're seeing every aspect of our living system shutting down. And we can see that what we're doing is not working. Nature conservation, as we've been doing it so far, it hasn't really been working, right? So by putting a price on these ecosystem services, the idea is that we can start to actually put a number on what's being lost, right? So if you're that company, that multinational, and you're going to that forest, and you're thinking, oh, I can just chop this down and make some lumber and make some money of that, then you can weigh that against, okay, well, what are the ecosystem services and what are the value of those, right? So it's about creating a mechanism for conservation and for essentially beginning to value nature, right? Because we haven't been valuing it at all so far. Only when that nature turns into money in our pocket, but not in place. But on the other side of the argument, and there's some really valid criticisms as well, are, that it's basically nonsense, because it's impossible to really put a value on ecosystem services, because those services are not just impacting humans and animals and living beings in the present, but they're impacting, they could impact thousands of lives into the future. We don't really know actually everything that's being impacted by that tree existing. And additionally, it just transfers more power to the already rich in a lot of cases. So we are talking about, how can we make accumulation, how can we accumulate rainforests, right? And part of the question is, well, who is accumulating those rainforests? Is it the same, is it promoting the same systems of power, or is are we giving that power to communities? Because, we can say, okay, well, we want to put a price on nature. So a forest might be worth $12,000 to the local community, but only $1,000 if you cut the wood down. But if it's worth $12,000 to a local community of kind of very humble fishermen, but it's worth $1,000 to a powerful multinational or local politician, then obviously that $1,000 is holds more weight, right? So I think it's really about, is it just giving another mechanism to preserve power, or is it actually, working to preserve nature and human society that is obviously a part of nature as well?
Yeah,
Yeah,
don't play Sam. Yeah.
Yeah, and along those lines of even if we put aside the $1,000 and even just measured it at that $12,000 mark, there could still be a very profitable pathway that leads some investor or any number of people to have a purchase point for that then kicks all of those humble fishermen out of that forest, right? And so it becomes really challenging to see ways to put that hard value onto things that have intrinsic value to us, but without having these units of game theoretic power that money is still take over the thing, because there are always going to be trade-offs. We're never going to be able to perfectly encapsulate the value of anything in our economic systems. There's always going to be a delta between our value metrics and the actual values that we hold as a society. Sorry. But so with that said, I think that it becomes really challenging to see ways to put those firm metrics there. But then on the flip side of that, it's a really hard problem, because if you're not putting the metrics, if you're not establishing a value, then how are we protecting it, right?
Yeah.
If we're not placing it firmly within the context of our economic system, then what outlets do we have? Does that relegate us to like violence? Or it seems like a really hard problem where there's not great answers, and especially looking at like where does that value come from? Because especially in poorer parts of the world, like it's one thing for people in super developed nations to be like, well, we don't want to cut the rainforest down because of X and Y, but in a poorer part of the world where that's the difference between dinner today or no dinner today, their calculation on that is also maybe much more weighted towards the short term. And so it's this very challenging problem of how do we deal with assigning value to that which cannot be perfectly quantified. And I think that really is at the heart of what we're trying to explore with this project on building sustainable economic systems.
First, I'm just going to spare a thought for these poor fishermen that are living in the forest. You'd hope that the fishermen would probably live near a lake rather than in the forest. But I think we ended up mixing our metaphors at some point there, but that's cool. Yeah, I think something that came up for me is just the whether we're seeing this like pricing of ecosystem services as something transitional or something kind of end stage. And I can imagine, I guess I probably do hold a position of like, ultimately, I would like to get to an economic system where we don't need to price ecosystem services, because we are all so in love with, attached to like the places that we live, that it just obviously doesn't make any sense to like price any particular tree, because each tree is special to someone, just like each human being is special to someone. Until I think we've got a lot of work to get to that point though. So like until we get to that point, then I think this could be an interesting way to go. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it does it does initially hold a certain promise, but definitely there's a lot of issues at hand that are already emerging. So for example, this idea of, enclosure. So we've seen that in the past, that, for example, particularly in the US, in the name of protecting lands, the government kicked out indigenous people and enclosed that land. And that's happening also now with pricing ecosystem services. It's just creating kind of a mechanism for larger companies and corporations to enclose land because they can make a profit, right? So it's kind of there's an issue here around ownership, as we said before. And of course, we can try and value those ecosystem services, but if they're going to be in the hands of corporations, then it's just going to be another mechanism for extraction, essentially. And another potential issue is around that's already emerging, is around making nature fungible, so that one asset can be substituted for another, right? So if there's kind of a rare or really old tree or forest over here, but a company wants to cut it down because they want to build a mall there, well, maybe they can just buy some tree credits and plant a forest somewhere else. Obviously, it's not the same thing. And we're seeing a lot of problems with tree planting projects in particular that just say, okay, we need to plant 100 trees, so let's just put these in the ground. And it's not the same just putting 100 trees in the ground as an old growth forest that's been there for thousands of years or more, right? And another thing on that note is also, how do you price history or cultural importance or like spiritual connection? All of those things are also connected to place, or should be connected to place. And it's really difficult to consider these different aspects. And I think at the end of the day, something that's really emerging for me is that it's always about values. When we put these whatever we're measuring, whatever value we think we're putting on something, it's always really about values. So morals rather than numbers, right? Because measurement is always a decision because it's representative. As we're saying, it is a form of abstraction. It's a picture, it's not the thing. So by choosing how to measure it, what to measure, how to process that data, we're always making essentially a decision that's based on values, which are qualitative, not quantitative. So, always, I think the quantitative nature of markets, of measurement, tends to hide that there's really a moral judgment or a priority-based kind of judgment behind that. And if the priority is always to extract and to make money, then no amount of pricing nature or ecosystem services is going to be able to change that, essentially.
I think I'm right in saying that the price of carbon is around like 100 euros a ton right now. And the IPCC have said that for this kind of carbon pricing mechanism to have any meaningful impact on the kind of climate crisis, it needs to be like 10 or even 30 times that by 2030, which is not that far away now. And essentially like governments, the EU in that case, like have complete power over setting the price of carbon. It just depends on how many kind of carbon credits that they're willing to issue. And so I mean, they could start moving it, towards that 10x, 30x figure tomorrow if the political will existed, which in turn is about like people actually having those values and then like making those demands of their governments. Of course, the likely impact of a carbon price that was like 10 or 30 times higher would be to make like most of the economy least the part of the economy that relies on fossil fuels, completely unprofitable. So it's which.
Another problem along those lines is even if those governments all did that tomorrow, what about the rest of the world, right?
Sure.
Where most of the
Sure.
population is. And
Sure.
then it becomes really easy to fall into that multipolar trap of like, well, if we do this and impose this cost upon ourselves, but nobody else does, then we're just putting ourselves at a disadvantage in the long-term race. And then isn't the world going to be even worse off if they're the ones with all the economic power, right? It becomes really, really easy to get stuck in this game. And so I think that the point that you raised earlier about what is this a transitional or a long-term solution of the placing the pricing on different natural things is a really important one as well. In that Ben versus Break series that I had mentioned earlier, Daniel and Nate talk about the 3 steps of addressing our predicaments, which are triage, transition, and more of a long-term solution. And so it seems to me like the narrow economic valuation of these problems is more in that triage camp of like how do we stop the bleeding of whatever it might be. But as you also alluded to, it's like something like carbon credits might be a meaningful measurement, but even that is just so narrow that there are so many things that it leaves out. And aren't we going to see problems where different sets of trade-offs emerge that potentially address the issue of carbon, but create other negative externalities because they're not adequately measured by the system?
But even looking past the fact that carbon is a very narrow measure, and even looking past the kind of Molochian dynamics of like, well, no one part of the world can do this, otherwise they like end up on bottom of the pile relative to other countries. Even then, like it's still a hard thing. It would still require the global population to say, okay, yes, let's increase carbon prices by 30 times. Knowing that that's going to put a whole load of industries out of business. And what I would say that what would have to the shift that would actually have to happen for us as like a global civilization to make that choice would be to say, okay, yes, we do actually value non-human life. We do not want to continue with extincting like non-human species. And yes, we do value the lives of all humans, particularly those humans in the global south. And I think we need to be quite honest and say like the current evidence suggests that at least Western civilization like does not place of much value on non-human life or the lives of those in the global south. And in a way that feels like an important step to just be able to sort of recognize that, or see that the evidence very much suggests that. And then we can start asking the question of, okay, well, are we comfortable with that? Like, is that truly our intention, or is that basically a kind of an accident, if you like? And now we can take deliberate action to change things and to create an economy based on a different set of values, as Andrea was alluding to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to maybe start kind of closing that off and talking about extraction. I think what's coming out for me out of this conversation is that it's about power in the end, and who has power, right? We're talking about the EU. Of course, they technically have the power to put that price up, but of course they have lobbyists from industry talking in their ear, and who is lobbying for the earth and for ecosystems, basically. So it's all about ownership and power, and who has the power to decide what is valuable and decide how much those ecosystems are worth. Because whoever has that power is the one that controls the outcomes.
Just briefly, it makes me think of the idea of having some kind of system of global governance, like a phrase that you hear increasingly to refer to people of the global south as people of the global majority. right? Understanding that actually there's way more people that live in non-Western countries than Western countries. And so if we did actually have some system where it was truly like one human, one vote, then probably things would be very different from here. Yeah.
Yeah. But is that further abstraction? I think there's another interesting point to say that, you know, and this is part of the difficulty, is that the more you scale up, also the more that you're abstracting. So one of the problems with the global economy, for example, is that you're asking people to essentially make decisions about understand the global market and what something might be worth to the highest bidders in the world or to someone in another part of the world, whereas the best information that you have is about you and your community. So essentially the point is, how are we able to create a global system, but without asking people to function, to process information about the whole world, to be able to just process information about the local community and be able to decide there, but that voice gets carried through to decisions that affect the whole world.
And also in that same process, not creating a centralized locus of control that has a total monopoly on violence with very little accountability. That's a very fine line to walk. And then the other issue along those lines is like you talked about, Stephen, there's so many people who live in the global south, right? But most of those people are also living in abject poverty, or at least a very significant percentage of them. And it gets back to one of the points that I made earlier of it's very difficult to ask somebody to sacrifice in the immediate term when that immediate term sacrifice is like not having food for their family right then, right? And so none of this will be easy. And what we're trying to accomplish here is not necessarily finding a perfect solution of a perfect economic system, because that's not something that exists, but more what we have already done of talking through the problem space and seeing what paths might be the best ones moving forward from here with a nuanced understanding of the various stakeholders in this equation.
Nice. Do you want to take us on to extraction?
Yeah, absolutely. And so along those lines, all systems are intrinsically embedded with the values that we encode during their design phase. So whether these optimization settings are constructed consciously or inadvertently, the incentives at the base will create a recursive cycle that influences the directional trend of the system over time. And so there are different ways to think about extraction, but the way that I'm thinking about extractive markets is a market where the negative externalities imposed is greater than the value added, but where it is still profitable. So there are profitable net negatives that are being perpetuated and thus driving more and more power to continuing to perpetuate those profitable net negatives. And so extractive actions are rewarded when our metrics define societal values too narrowly. And so the goal here isn't to demonize positive incentives, but to decouple profit from antisocial externalities. And I think there's an important false dichotomy that I would like to point out, which is that often economists talk about positive sum versus zero sum games, which can be a useful framing, but I think it's equally important to acknowledge that negative sum games will be played when self-interested agents are incentivized to do so. And so when we think about programming our values, the long-term abstract of what we need to aim for is the most profitable actions must be those with the most widespread social benefit. The most prohibitively costly actions must be those with the most widespread social harm. And that understanding any inversion of this equation will create perverse incentives. And we understand this intrinsically in other domains, such as violent crime. If murdering someone was punished with a $50 fine and no possibility of jail time, what would happen? It's not that every single person would suddenly become a murderer, but there would be a larger percentage of the population that would. And specifically on the tail end of that distribution, you would see those with no qualms about committing murder have their murder rate go up exponentially because there is no deterrence or quarantine in that process. And this thought experiment shares some concerning similarities with the incentives that govern corporations, because our markets currently create internal and external selection pressures, so both within corporations and between corporations, that optimize for amoral agents who are willing to take the actions with the most profit potential regardless of societal harm. And there's countless examples that we could go into of this, whether it's the 2008 financial crisis or some of the pharmaceutical incentives that we see. But that really is at the root of extractive behavior, is where we are incentivizing a net negative for a particular agent to impose onto others because it profits themselves, and in profiting themselves perpetuates a cycle of power that results in the continuous accumulation of more power and more influence over the set of rules that govern what is profitable. And so I'll leave it there and let you guys jump in.
Nice. Yeah, I was actually, since you kind of touched on punishments there, but then I was actually thinking about that in the context of or researching it actually in the context of like carbon credits as well. I'd be like, okay, so what happens if an organization is pumping out loads of carbon and they don't bother to buy these credits? The answer is like they get a fine, but I can certainly imagine that, in many cases that probably isn't a sufficient deterrent, or at least it's a kind of a deterrent that's kind of like within the same frame. And you may know that there's a group called Stop Ecocide that have been pushing for like the crime of ecocide to be recognized, I think, of it both the EU and UN levels, and they're just starting to have some progress there. But for punishments and deterrents to be commensurate, or almost like even like a higher order than the kind of the act itself, seems to be potentially quite an important piece of the puzzle to me.
Yeah, the next sentence on my write-up is: effective deterrence for causing harm requires negative repercussions to be greater than the profit potential, to the extent that a self-interested rational actor is never incentivized to cause harm. So pretty much exactly
Nice.
what you just said there.
Cool.
And then along those lines, though, the other thing that I wanted to point out is that malevolence is not the only source of negative externalities, nor is it necessarily the most concerning. And so I included a quote from MLK, which is: nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity, right? And that really gets back to this core question that we have: how do we properly encode our values into our systems? Because it's very easy to say, okay, here are some of the things that our current economic systems are completely overlooking, and that's important, but it also requires the further examination of what are the second, third, fourth order consequences of what might happen if we institute that new set of incentives. Because as I said before, there's always going to be a delta between our value metrics and the actual values that they are meant to represent. And so one of the things that I think is a key criteria for a sustainable economic system, because no single metric or set of metrics can perfectly encapsulate our full scope of values. So future economic systems must be constructed around the principles of iterative evolution and anti-fragility. So we're going to continue to get better over time, and the top priority is not to break everything, right? And then along those lines, a sustainable economic system must generate better approximations of our value over time, rather than blindly optimizing an incomplete metric that serves as a temporary proxy for those values. So instead of having the primary optimization setting being, say, okay, this right now is the closest that we've got. Right now that metric is GDP, right? Instead of just blindly driving that forward, the top priority of a sustainable economic system would need to be creating better approximations of those values over time rather than the blind optimization of that proxy itself.
Yeah. Nice. And about a values level, it makes me think of prioritizing humility over arrogance. And arrogance seems to be a value that's pretty deeply baked into the modern economic system in lots of ways. And another frame that relates to which Daniel has spoken about recently is the work of Ian McGilchrist and his work on the difference between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, that and suggesting that in many ways we live in a left hemisphere dominated world that is characterized by or related to this kind of this arrogance and this and in contrast, the right hemisphere has a much more holistic view of things and would be much more interested in actually asking that question about, like, actually, what even is the right metric to maximize here? To me, that sounds like a much more interesting game in a way. It's like the meta game of not just okay, how do you maximize the metric? Of like, why are we even maximizing this, and to what end, to what purpose? Like, it feels to me there's so much more richness in that question.
Yeah. And along those lines, that balance of finding epistemic humility, but without falling into a bystander effect of sorts, of where we're like, well, we don't really know what the right answer is, therefore we can't act. Well, that's not going to work, because then we're outsourcing the acting to the people who believe that they have the right answer and may not have thought about that what you were describing as the more right hemisphere, more holistic side of things, in trying to think about their initial suppositions more carefully, right? So that there's a balance to be struck there between saying, you know what, we definitely don't have all the answers, but at the same time, if what we're doing is concretely not working, we do need to find ways to move forward. And as far as exactly what that is, I don't think any of us are going to pretend to know, but it is an important counterpoint to what I was raising before about, like, there are clear issues with GDP as a metric. Like, for example, it will value your grandmother as more valuable if she has cancer than if she doesn't, which is clearly not something that we want to incentivize. But at the same time, I don't have a better metric than GDP as it stands, right? And
wow. So but I mean, people have been thinking about and writing about this topic for actually some decades now, right? So, like, it's not like that, there are a bunch of suggestions, but all of which have something to recommend them. So I don't want to overstate how hard this problem is. It's like, it's fairly well recognized that GDP is terrible in lots of ways. I think the interesting question is, like, given that it's so widely understood to be insufficient, like, why are we still using it? What are the dynamics that are, like, keeping us locked into something that, like, more and more people understand is clearly just ridiculous?
Exactly. And that's more what I was trying to express, is not so much that there's not improvements that we can make beyond GDP, but how do we get that system that incentivizes for the better approximations of the values over time, rather than cementing in something that is a slight improvement, but does not actually address the fundamental issue of the problem, which is what you said before. The more interesting question to think about is, how do we get to that place of where we are thinking about our values more carefully, and where we are better programming those values into our systems with much more intention.
Yeah. Just briefly, and then I'll go to you, Andrea. But, like, it makes me think of, like, the difference between, like, a political campaign that says, okay, we shouldn't be maximizing GDP, we should be maximizing, like, gross national happiness or some well-being metric, versus saying, okay, we actually need a department of maximization, where there's like an ongoing process, an ongoing quest for a certain section of government to actually consider, okay, what are the proper things to be maximizing at that time, rather than it being as simple as just switching from one metric to another. And whilst there are, I think Bhutan does actually seek to maximize gross national happiness or something like this, but what I'm hearing from you is, like, even that could cease to be, like, a decent metric, or, like, the right metric at some point, and we'll I think the strongest case, like, we'll necessarily have unforeseen consequences, and so we have to like keep constantly be reevaluating like what makes sense here. Yeah, Andrea.
Yeah. So sorry.
Mhm.
One last thought, and then but
Yeah, go ahead.
it's more about the protocols themselves that we're instituting, and how do we build those protocols with that recursive cycle of evolution, so that built into the protocol is the questioning of the protocol, right? And go for it, Andrea.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think whenever you try and maximize one single metric, it will always go wrong. You know, we've all heard probably of the paperclip maximizer. It's just, if you just optimize for one metric, there's always going to be externalities. The point is kind of like balancing, you know, different things within an ecosystem. And I was also going to say, kind of on a slightly different note, I think we're talking about, you know, why don't we, if we know that these other metrics exist, you know, why aren't we using them? And I think part of it is that, you know, it's kind of, I don't know if a cosmetic shift is the right word, but maybe it's not a paradigm shift. It's not going deep enough to really understand, well, is optimizing for a metric what we should be doing at all? Is there a different way of doing things? And I think it's something interesting that Daniel Schmachtenberger said in his article, which is really was a paradigm shift for me, is that, you know, he talks about how extraction is essentially, in other words, profit. So, you know, in a closed system, not everyone can profit, because you're always taking value gained on one side is lost from another side. You know, it's kind of essentially just moving around the value. So the profit is being created by extracting value from nature or from other people. And that really made me think about, you know, you mentioned profit and kind of making profit aligned with the things that we consider positive. But, you know, from what Daniel Schmachtenberger has written, it really makes me think, well, is profit really, you know, do we even need to rethink the idea of profit? You know, what is really profit? Is it just kind of money in someone's pocket? And do we need to get rid of profit altogether? And, you know, instead of that money going into someone's pocket, that money is reinvested in the community. You know, how do we do the way that we even understand profit or understand value need to change completely?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. The precise sentence that I wrote that I think you were referring to says, the goal isn't to demonize positive incentives, but to decouple profit from antisocial externalities. And I think that's a key distinction, because no matter what system that we're working in, we're going to have some form of incentives. And whether we want to call that profit or use a different word, and obviously there are status things that are like correlated with profit, but separate from that, right? There are many different aspects of human psychology that can incentivize us to act in one way or another. But it really gets back to, how are we encoding those values at the rate, or at the base of the system? Because what we encode at the base is going to perpetuate itself. Like we've mentioned a few times, the stickiness of the existing metrics that we have, and even if there's better ones, well, why are the metrics that we currently have staying around? And I think there's multiple ways to think about that problem, which one of them is just that change is hard, and we're going to tend to trend towards default settings more so than anything else. But another one is that when you create an optimization setting, the system itself will perpetuate that optimization setting, because anyone who is succeeding within that system is incentivized to perpetuate the trend of the system, right? Because if they're already accruing power within that game, why would they want to change the rules of the game? And if they're accruing power within that game, those are the people who have the most influence over the rules of the game. So they're going to make it bend in their own favorable direction, which is going to be more along the lines of the default status quo and a degradation of that status quo, because that is what has already brought them success in the first place. There's no reason that they would want to change what's bringing them success other than to bring them more success, because that's what has been selected for by the pressures that exist. Does that make sense?
And I would say that's the kind of peak promise of blockchain and Web3 technology, actually, right? It's people saying the current economic system is rigged beyond control. The people with the money also have the power. There's no hope of it changing. And here's a technology that, at least in principle, can allow us to invent completely new economic systems starting from some kind of new base. Now, whether in practice that technology is going to be useful remains to be seen. But that's certainly my attraction to the technology. And going back to what you said, Andrea, I think like you're saying, I think it's a really interesting point you raise around profit, but I was, well, what is the place for profit? You essentially framed it as a zero or even negative sum phenomena. I mean, it seems clear to me that if it's a negative sum phenomena, like if, for example, as long as someone's profiting, then we're destroying the planet, then that's obviously not good news. If we can get it to a point where it's zero sum, that might be okay in some situations, but people do enjoy playing zero-sum games in a way. There's a football match, there's a winner and there's a loser. People still do it because that's, it can kind of be fun in some contexts. So I think the context is really important. And basically, in that sense, I'll say, okay, let's use profit, let's use markets for things that don't matter that much, where we are treating it just like entertainment, basically. And can we find ways to ensure that all the things that really matter, like a healthy ecosystem and healthy, happy human beings and so on, and quality education and all these things, they're taken care of in other ways that don't rely on the whims of the market to decide, does this species live or die, and does that person get healthcare or not? I think that it intuitively feels like a promising direction to head.
Well, yeah. And the way that I like to think about markets is that they can be very, very good at finding the optimal way to do something, but they are much less good at deciding what we should do, if that distinction makes sense, right?
Yeah, markets don't have value systems. Only humans can have value systems, right? I think that's what it comes down to, which we've been speaking about a lot, is a market doesn't understand the spiritual value of a tree, and can it really understand that? It's for humans to decide. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about Web3, because I think in terms of incentivizing and managing funds, I think one really interesting thing that I've seen from Web3 is this idea of exploring different ways to identify what public goods should get funded and create incentives to fund and to build those public goods, and incentives that are not related to necessarily a profit motive and that are not tied to kind of a centralized government. And I think that's one aspect of Web3 that's really interesting for me, is how do you incentivize things not through the promise of necessarily one group or person profiting, but because to support kind of the good of the community and a common goal. So I think that aspect is something that I would love to explore more.
Thanks. Well, maybe that's a good time to sort of turn to some concluding remarks. If that's okay with you, Sam, did you want to say anything more on extraction?
Sure. So I'll actually just tie it into what we were talking about with
Yeah.
Web3 just now, is I think that each of us would have our own criticisms of the existing Web3 environment, but that we also respect that there is a community of people who are trying to build something new, and that is something that we should encourage. Now, one of the main criticisms that I know from our previous conversations that we share is that the existing incentives of the crypto slash Web3 ecosystem that largely revolve around number go up are very, very similar to the system that we're trying to move forward from, right? And so along those lines, I think that's one of the important things that we need to address, is how do we balance the long-term paradigm shift that's necessary for sustainability versus the immediate action steps that are necessary for the actual implementation of a new system, right? Because we can't just have like some naive utopia of like this is the perfect economic system that we're going to create, but have no actionable path to get there, while at the same time we can't just allow our efforts to become 2.0 of the existing game that we're playing, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's an interesting way to move into our conclusion and what we want to capture with this podcast moving forward.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so one of the things we were speaking about before is I hope that this podcast can bring economic thinkers in on all kinds of different sectors, Web3 and AI and more political thinkers, back to first principles. And just saying, hang on a minute, like what even is an economy? What is it for? And I think our sense is that we've right now we've got some of those points wrong at quite a fundamental level, and why we were interested in Daniel's blog piece, where he's like really trying to dig down to something like the base of an economy, or like the dynamics of the present economic system. So I'm really looking forward to kind of really staying at that deep level and across a variety of topics, and broadly working out how we can create this new kind of positive sum win-win economic system.
Yeah, and speaking of Daniel Schmachtenberger, he has, for those who know him, has done a great job of outlining, what the Metacrisis is, what are the different mechanisms of the Metacrisis, what has led us here, and also is doing a great job of communicating that and going out there and educating people on it. And so now it's up to us to really consider what the response is going to be. What are we're understanding more and more the problem space. So what does the solution space look like? And how can we move more towards creating not just responses, but a unified response in the right direction? Taking that diagnosis and turning it into action.
Nice. How about you, Sam?
Yeah, and really with this Reforging the Ring project that we're taking on, I've thought about our main theme as, how do we build a ring of power that doesn't turn Smeagol into Gollum, right? How do we create that system where we've consciously embedded those values so that it drives us in a pro-social direction rather than an anti-social direction? And really that is for all of this, like the groups that you mentioned, Stephen, whether it's Web3 or artificial intelligence or political systems, all of these things are questions of conscientious system design, and how do we encode our values, and maybe even more importantly than just encoding our present values, how do we encode our epistemic humility surrounding those values and the ways in which we deliver upon them imperfectly into the protocols of our systems as we design them from the jump, right? And with the assumption that we need to make something that is operational today but that we need to leave it room to grow so that those who are better equipped with more information and more expertise than we have because of the progress that we're able to make in the present still have room to help those systems evolve tomorrow. And I think that I'm really excited for what we're working on here of bringing people from those different disciplines together to get their ideas and expertise on conscious systems design and the ways that we can improve the world around us to build a brighter future.
Nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about, bringing people together, I think something that we really want to do on this podcast is bring people together, bring people on the podcast, guests from all walks of life that are working on the Metacrisis, on responses to the Metacrisis, or even that have lived experience of the Metacrisis or of some of these solutions, right? Because something I know we've discussed before is, an expert isn't necessarily someone who's working in Web3, creating a new economy, or working within the political system, but an indigenous person with lived experience of alternative systems, or someone working within a cooperative that has that firsthand knowledge of how everything works together. So I think part of what we really want to do is bring those different voices to the table and bring them on this podcast and just have discussions from different perspective and with different kinds of voices in the mix.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say we're all kind of tech curious, right? Including like Web3 curious, but also kind of not married to the technology in the way that sometimes you see in the space, actually, that like you hear this thing of like Web3 is a solution looking for a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't sense that that's quite the place that we're at. We're willing to see that it has a role to play, or maybe not. But like, let's speak to some of the best thinkers on these topics and figure it out together.
Yeah, absolutely. As well as integrating the experience of the stakeholders of these systems, like Andrea was saying, because I think that can be one of the areas in which abstraction is the most dangerous of we kind of just think about this amorphous blob of humanity and forget the actual individuals who are living on a day-to-day basis within the incentive structures that are created, whether consciously or inadvertently. And so bringing those voices into the room in conjunction with the people who are working on the systems design, I think is the best way to build a bridge between the various disciplines who are going to be constructing the future of our world.
Nice. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap, and an invitation to anyone listening to go and take a walk in your local forest or walk around your local lake and sign up to your local community supported agriculture scheme. Like start developing that connection to place once more. And we hope to be back pretty soon, I guess, with future episodes of this podcast. I'm sure there'll be details of how you can keep in touch with us in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have anything to add or contribute to this conversation, make sure to get in touch and maybe we'll have you on the podcast.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Yeah, this was great.